So while a mom is pregnant, the courts really don't have any jurisdiction over her. It's not like an action can be filed, and because at least under Florida law, they're not married, so dad doesn't have any rights, and there's no baby to even have rights to at this point in time, she could really technically move anywhere she wanted, and I would assume that that's true anywhere because there's nothing to file against her when the child is not born yet. So you have to start thinking about like the pros and cons if you have a choice between a long-distance parenting plan and not having a long-distance parenting plan. You have to start thinking about the consequences of that and what that's really going to mean, because while you may want to move and there may be a lot of benefits to moving, especially if you're young and you're 18 and your family's not going to be there with you and you're still in high school just graduating when you have this baby, there's certainly a lot to take into consideration. But you also want to take into consideration that with a long-distance parenting plan, yes, you're going to have fewer times that the child is with the other parent, but when they're with the other parent, it's going to be for a lot more duration. It's a lot more nights, a lot more extended period of time. And for a lot of parents, especially first-time parents, young parents, parents of little teeny babies, the idea of being away from your baby for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or the summer is just mind-boggling. It's not something you could even contemplate. Whereas the idea of being away from the baby for a couple days and then having the baby back for a couple days may be more palatable to you. So you have to think about that kind of stuff, because if it's going to be a long distance plan, it means you are going to be away from the child for extended periods of time. And that may not make your life easier. In some instances, it might. Especially in really high conflict situations and with a little bit older kid, sometimes it's just better to deal with the longer absences than to deal with the day-to-day interactions. So I had a really interesting conversation with this young mom, and it brought me back to my early days as an attorney when I ran the teen advocacy program of legal aid and represented a lot of young parents in custody things and domestic violence actions, dating actions, all of that. And it was kind of fun to tap back into that a little bit. And this particular mom, even though she's young, seems super motivated and also insightful, because she realizes that while she's still pregnant and she's a young mom, she really has a hard time wrapping her head around even what parenthood's going to be like. So with the dad and his family reaching out and trying to settle and trying to get parenting plans in place when she's still pregnant, she's having a difficult time making those decisions, which makes sense because she doesn't even have the baby yet. However, I also talked to her about the fact that after the baby's born, then the dad's actually going to be able to file. And at that point in time, you're not going to have a lot of choice but to negotiate, because once something's filed, you're going to have to figure this stuff out. And right after having a baby, I've had 2 of them, you're super emotional. Your brain is not always functioning the way that it always does. You're deprived of sleep, you're super hormonal, and I don't know that that's really the time that you want to start negotiating a parenting plan either. Plus, all your mama bear instincts are kicking in, and it's really challenging with all of those mama bear instincts to negotiate a plan that's going to involve you being away from the child. There's a whole other thing to consider from this conversation, so tune in for part 3. So today I had the opportunity at the end of a very long day to talk to an 18-year-old girl who is still in high school and pregnant and having a baby this summer. She lives in another state, and her parents, who she lives with, are contemplating moving to Florida. And so I wasn't really able to give a lot of information about the other state because I don't practice there. I don't know what their laws are, and wasn't able to really advise her about that. But I was able to talk to her about what Florida law is and what would happen if Florida did have jurisdiction. And that raised a couple of good points that I thought would be interesting to talk about. So the first was a jurisdictional question about what state's going to have jurisdiction over the child. So at this point in time, the child's not born. And one of the questions that came up is like, can somebody file before the child's born? No, there's no child under the law of any state really. So you're not going to be able to file an action regarding the child before the child is born. And that's true in Florida. So you can't file anything until then. So that was number 1. Number 2 was, if the child is born in Florida, Florida would have jurisdiction over this child. So, however, if the child is not born in Florida, At least under the way Florida law works, if the child was born here and then a parent moved out of the state, Florida would still have jurisdiction over that child for some period of time if the child was born here, if you left after the child is born. And that's going to be true in the opposite direction too, because that's governed by the UCCJEA. So if the child is born in the other state and then mom moves to Florida, the other state is still going to have jurisdiction unless the child remains in Florida for 6 months. So those were two of the important or interesting things that came out of this conversation. And stay tuned to the next video for more thoughts about this.